So first up is the aforementioned Irishman, which is Scorsese's epic masterpiece about painting houses and interior carpentry. But no, it's his second Netflix film of the year after his Bob Dylan documentary Rolling Thunder Review. Based on the book by Charles Brandt, I Heard You Paint Houses, about Frank Sheeran, who was involved, initially always with the Buffalino crime family, but then ultimately was the enforcer, house painter of Jimmy Hoffa. And much like Sergio Leone's Once Upon a Time in America, it takes Robert De Niro as an old man, but now he's actually old, looking back on his life in said enforcement role. So Jim, let's start with you. What do you think?
I think it's brilliant. Really, I went into I'm a big Martin Scorsese fan, particularly the work he's done with Robert De Niro, so I don't think it's any necessarily much of a surprise that I like the film. I'm surprised at how much I liked it, because going into it, I think the two headline things that you know about this film going into it are it is 3.5 hours long, and they've made use of the kind of the de-aging tech, which is very in vogue now. Those are the things you know going in. So you kind of get this idea that it's, as Paul said, it's kind of like one final hurrah on the way to the graveyard, if you're right. So, because everybody involved, everybody is getting on a bit. I was surprised at how much of his filmography Scorsese blends together here. So the popular notion of Scorsese's films are, the gangster themed ones, or the ones that are kind of crime focused, so The Departed, Goodfellas, Casino, Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, that sort of thing. But he does have that other aspect to his filmmaking, which is a lot more spiritual, a lot more contemplative, and kind of rooted in religious thought almost. And the most obvious examples of that are probably the film he did before this, Silence, and I think The Last Temptation of Christ is probably the other one that would come to mind for me. And I think he's really done a wonderful job of blending the sort of criminal hijinks of some of his most popular films with the deep soul-based questions that you will find in his other work. Because it's not to say that the morality of some of the things that these gangster characters do hasn't been questioned in his films before. They have. But this one, it really takes you into the moral rot that sets in. And this idea of people following a code, right? Because all of these mob-based films are, they're very based in ideas of honor and loyalty and all this sort of stuff. But this film really takes to the nth degree the effect that has on someone across decades. In other films, even other films of his, it's dealt with. It absolutely is. But here, it is really, it sinks in. And I think that's, for me, part of the reason I did not feel the length.
Well, I would agree. For me, the argument, I've seen you write about this already. Thelma Schoonmaker's editing here is amazing, but it's not just individual scenes and shots. It is the fact that if you go for the whole 3.5 hour mark, you feel everything building up to that last 30 minutes because of the way the film is structured. It is even though it's the most contemplative, as you said, and melancholic part of the film, the last 30 minutes is a powerhouse based on the brickwork of everything before. I'm sorry, I keep making these housing references, but yeah. Really,
this film is superb, and I think the way it blends those things is fantastic. I think this is... I'm very wary of using the word masterpiece, right? But I would be surprised if I don't think of that this way come the end of the next decade. And far from it just being Scorsese's, it is Thelma Schoonmaker's. It is paced to perfection, it is edited fantastically, and if she put a single foot wrong in this film, you'd start to feel the length, and I really did not.
Paul, what did you think?
Yeah, I'll go pretty much along with what Jim said. It's probably, for me, one of the films of the last decade, perhaps. It was fantastic. I would say there's a few things. Obviously the de-aging technique was quite interesting. I think also they re-aged them as well, so it wasn't just de-aging. They made them much older than they currently are. It worked okay. It didn't really distract from the film. I mean, you didn't really look for it. You didn't really make you feel that you were checking out how good it was. But I think that one of the problems, there's a few things with the film, and one of them is the fact that although they de-age them at 40, they still move like they're 75. There's a scene where De Niro is kicking somebody's head in, and it looks like he's stepping over a puddle. So there's little elements like, apart from that, I think the whole thing holds up incredibly well. And as you say, the editing is fantastic. There's a lot of very short scenes which are elaborate setups, which are only on screen for 10, 20, 30 seconds. So an incredible amount of detail and work that's gone into that.
I agree about for me, the de-aging didn't work. But everything about the film outside of it was like, it made it forgivable. And it's cool to see Scorsese not being an old fart and experimenting. He had this whole thing where it's like, there'd be like 16 different lenses, on 4 different cameras and stuff like that. And that like the ILM tech guys would come in and do like a Eucharist procession. That's the way he described it. And then they would go away. It's like, okay, we can shoot a film again. So it's like, even though, he still doesn't get the techniques of it, he is experimenting. And it's great to see like a 76-year-old doing that. And that Netflix is doing that as well. That Netflix is producing that, considering, other studios did turn him down. Despite the cast and the project,
Yeah, and for me, the technical, like that part of it, the de-aging, for me, it pretty much works. Like Paul's spot on, and I've written about this. The way, the manner in which it falls down is they still have the body language of men in their late 70s. It's just kind of like that slight hunch, the slight slowness in the movement. And unfortunately, that scene where he's beating up a greengrocer, unfortunately, that's where it stands out the most. For me, it didn't really take away from it, and some of them deal with it better than others. Like, for instance, I actually think Al Pacino deals with it quite well. Particularly some of his scenes as kind of, like 50-ish-year-old Jimmy Hoffa, he does quite well, I think. I think his body language and the way he moves is actually a lot better. There's so many aspects to this film. It's also a very funny film, actually. For something that's dealing with like a historical thing, which is actually kind of tragic and is shrouded in mystery and kind of like really quite, in some cases morally repugnant people. There's a lot of humour here.
Well, I would say, like, for me, there was always a spiritual trilogy between or among Goodfellas, Casino, and Wolf of Wall Street. Because there was a progression of criminality to sort of legitimize criminality, whereas like this, whilst it has the style, stands out because of the self-awareness. And the scene that stands out is when Hoffa is screaming at his other enforcers, and De Niro walks out like offended, and then Pacino goes out and he's like, no, like I didn't mean it, like take off. He starts taking off his coat, like two old men sort of like bickering at each other. So this is definitely for me a film that only a 76-year-old could have made, but like the self-awareness, the comedy was so, and it's not as violent either as those other gangster pictures that he's made,
Which is actually interesting, because then when it does have its violent moments, and it's not gory violence, but it is shocking. It is shocking violence, and it's more like, it's like, Robert De Niro being some sort of like, grey-haired Terminator or something like that. Like, it's kind of shocking in that regard. I think one other thing that's interesting about the performances, especially given we've just commented about the fact that there is humour in this, like, that kind of like wisecracking that you know of in mob films, it's done very well. But the thing that I find interesting about it is one character that really doesn't engage in it at all and actually probably plays against type is Joe Pesci.
Yeah,
and I think it's a wonderful performance from him, and his performance spans the same ages as De Niro's. Like, we go from when he's, not necessarily a young man, but he's certainly not, he's certainly not old, kind of like pre-middle aged, through to kind of like him being very elderly. And I think the consistency of performance he's got there, and the measured way he approaches that character of is it Russell Bufalino, is really superb, and it's kind of against type, because you think of Joe Pesci as the guy in Goodfellas, I'm funny to you, how, and My Cousin Vinny, and even like Home Alone and things like that. And he's done a variety of roles in his career, and not all of them have been in that mode, but I think this is kind of one of the biggest profile ones where he plays against the popular perception of him.
Added to that, much like Scorsese's other films, this is a very talk heavy film, but for me it's Joe Pesci's Rana Paquin's silence that really kind of carries forth what the film is about, which is euphemisms and the effect of violence and sociopathy on other family members. And yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what you guys think about it, because the other part of the performances is, which there's been a little bit of discussion about, is Anna Paquin's role as Frank Sheeran's daughter. What did you two make of that? Because I have my thoughts, and I think it was very effective, but I'm interested in what you thought.
Yeah, I thought she was very good. I mean, very little screen time, and I don't think she had more than one or two lines. Beyond that, she's very effective. I mean, it was all in glances and looks to camera, and very, very strong performance. And I think that did bring out, the overall theme of regret and reflection, and that it reminded me actually a little bit towards the end of the film. There's a sequence. I don't want to spoil it, but there's a sequence where he goes to visit his daughter, and she's working in a bank at the time. And it reminded me of the scene in Johnny Depp film, I think it was Blow, where he's dreaming about his daughter visiting him when he's in prison. And it had that kind of real emotional power about it, a real sadness. So I thought that was extremely effective, and she was absolutely fantastic, I think.
Well, I mean, I think cinema is not just about the spoken word. It is about someone, the way someone looks, not in terms of looks, in terms of the emotion that's registered on the face. And I think, well, it's not just Anna Paquin. It's also like that character is also a little girl, and she's really good. That actor, the little girl that plays her, is just someone that is bottling things up, but still maintaining composure as well, but is clearly affected by it. I think that's the counterpoint, and that's Scorsese's. He understands the visual.
Yeah, and I think there's different categories of performance in the film, and I think Anna Paquin's is the best one that exhibits what you can do without dialogue. And it really hammers home, for me, a lot of the themes of the film and the journey of, her character as well, but also the role that plays in the central journey of Frank Sheeran. There are other roles in the film that I think exhibit the same sort of thing. We've already spoken about Joe Pesci. I think the amount he does with dialogue-free scenes is very impressive. It's a very small role that Harvey Keitel gets, but he's in the same category. It's more about what is not said and kind of like the way that things come through on his face rather than in his words. And then you've got the more talkative roles, Al Pacino. He has his contemplative moments, but generally I would think he gets a lot of dialogue and a lot of speaking lines, and he does as good a job as you would expect. I mean, I think it's the best thing Al Pacino's been in for decades, quite frankly.
Yeah.
It's the best performance I've seen him put in.
It is a very Al Pacino performance.
Well, yeah, but it's the good Al Pacino. It's the good stereotypical Al Pacino performance. Like, yes, he's very loquacious and he gets very animated at points.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like that. Like I for one don't really care for Scent of a Woman, right? That to me it kind of goes the other side of the line in terms of the sort of like an Al Pacino performance, copyright, register, trademark, right? All that, what you expect of it. To me, it feels a little bit more like the slightly more character-driven anger and animation of other roles he's done.
Well, I think the test of that as well is particularly when we get closer to Hoffa's disappearance, if we're going to call it that. He does show when he's still stubborn about his role as union leader and stuff like that. He touches the right points, in terms of emotion and subtlety as well. I think you're right. Yeah,
I think the performances are good. It's made headlines because it's like, Pesci, De Niro, Pacino, right? And I think it deserves to be noted for bringing them together, because more importantly, it's got brilliant performances out of all of them. I mean, because there's other films that, like, De Niro and Pacino have been in together. Like, what was it?
Righteous Kill.
Righteous Kill. That was it. It was a load of it was a load of nonsense, right? So, just getting them together doesn't do it. You need to get a good performance from them. This film absolutely does that. It absolutely does it. It's the best thing that Pacino has been in decades. I think it's really the best thing that De Niro has been in quite a long time as well. And for that, I'm grateful, because those are kind of like two of my favourite on-screen actors, but they've not made a lot in recent years that I want to see. But this, it's fantastic.
I was kind of trepidatious about the film going in, because seeing the trailers, I was worried about the way it looked, because I only ever saw it on a laptop, the trailers, and it did look a bit like the washed out color grade of a Netflix film. It did feel a bit televisual, but I, like you, we saw it on the big screen, and I mean, that car going through the car wash is breathtaking. Like, it's a slow, and for me as well, is on top of the de-aging, I like what Scorsese is doing stylistically with he started using a lot of slow motion. Like you saw it in Wolf of Wall Street when they're taking the Quaaludes and stuff like that, but here there's there's that scene where there's some sort of, I can't remember, there's a union demonstration, guy gets shot by Crazy Joe or whatever, and then there's this this Caravaggio shots of like slow motion that he's perfected, and of course the editing helps it, but like it's like what De Palma said when he saw Raging Bull. It's like there's always Scorsese like just upping the game, and he's still doing it at 76. So